He invited his poor ex to his yacht party to humiliate her. She arrived on a super yacht with his biggest investor. Jason sent the invitation specifically to watch his ex-girlfriend crumble in front of his wealthy friends. Proof that he was right to throw her away 3 years ago. But when a super yacht twice the size of his pulled up and Brianna stepped off in Balmain with Richard Callahan, the billionaire investor Jason had been desperately pitching for months. His champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. What Jason didn't know was that the unscalable idea he'd publicly mocked her for was now worth 8 figures, funded by the one man whose approval could save or destroy him, and Richard had already made his choice. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. In the glittering waters off the Amalfi coast, where wealth whispered and egos roared, Jason Whitmore's world was defined by appearances. Yachts measured success. Champagne glasses measured connections. And invitations? Those measured power. The kind of power Jason had built carefully, ruthlessly, over the last 3 years since his tech startup caught the attention of venture capitalists who valued ambition over ethics. Jason Whitmore was a man obsessed with status. Everything he touched, from his Italian leather loafers to the way he pronounced Prosecco, screamed superiority. His friends called him driven. His employees called him demanding. His ex-girlfriend, Brianna Ellis, had once called him cruel. But Jason preferred a different word: selective. He only surrounded himself with people who elevated him. People who belonged in his world. That's why he'd thrown Brianna away 3 years ago. She'd been smart, yes. Dangerously so. Her ideas had sparkled with the kind of innovation that could reshape industries. But she came from the wrong zip code, wore thrift store blazers to networking events, and worst of all, had the audacity to dream bigger than him. So he'd ended it publicly, at a rooftop bar in front of mutual colleagues, telling her she'd never make it past Midtown, and that some people simply lack the pedigree for this life. He'd watched her walk away in tears, convinced he'd made the right choice. What Jason didn't see, what his arrogance wouldn't allow him to see, was that Brianna's ambition had never needed his validation. While he was busy curating Instagram posts of his entrepreneur lifestyle, she'd been quietly building something real. Something scalable. Something that would eventually catch the attention of the one person Jason needed more than anyone else. When Brianna left Jason's world 3 years ago, she left with nothing but a battered laptop, a business plan scribbled in coffee-stained notebooks, and a prayer whispered into sleepless nights. The city that had once felt full of possibility now felt like a maze of closed doors. She moved into a cramped studio in a neighborhood Jason wouldn't even drive through, took side gigs answering emails for overwhelmed CEOs, and ate ramen while other people her age posted vacation photos from Santorini. But in the quiet hours between shifts, Brianna made herself a promise. This isn't the end. This is the pause before the crescendo. She refused to let Jason's words define her ceiling. If he believed she didn't belong in his world, then she'd build a better one. The turning point came through an unexpected ally. Richard Callahan, a reclusive billionaire tech investor known for funding disruptive innovations, attended a small pitch event where Brianna presented her concept. A localized AI-powered platform designed to up-level minority-owned businesses through predictive logistics. While other investors yawned or checked their phones, Richard leaned forward. After her presentation, he approached her with a question that would change everything. Why hasn't anyone funded this yet? Brianna's answer was honest. Because I don't look like the founders they're used to betting on. Richard nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Then let's change what a founder looks like. Over the next 18 months, Brianna's platform, Ellis Dynamics, quietly launched in 3 pilot cities. Revenue grew. Users multiplied. Press coverage trickled in from TechCrunch. then Forbes, then Bloomberg. What Jason had dismissed as cute and unscalable was now projected to disrupt a $40 billion industry. Meanwhile, Jason's own startup had plateaued, burning through cash faster than it generated revenue. Desperate for a Series B round, Jason's team sent funding decks to every major investor they could find, including one to Richard Callahan's firm. Jason never bothered to research who Richard's latest portfolio companies were. If he had, he would have seen Brianna's name at the very top of the list. This hidden truth that Brianna had not only survived but thrived, and that the very investor Jason needed most was now her mentor, partner, and advocate, set the stage for a reckoning Jason never saw coming. When the gilded invitation arrived in Brianna's inbox, embossed with Jason's yacht party details and dripping with condescension, she didn't delete it. She didn't rage. She simply forwarded it to Richard with a single line. "He has no idea, does he?" Richard's reply was immediate. "Then let's show him." Gracefully. And so Brianna prepared to return, not to prove Jason wrong, but to remind herself how far she'd come without him. What Jason intended as a stage for her humiliation would become the setting for her quiet, devastating triumph. But to understand how Jason Whitmore became a man capable of such cruelty, and how Brianna Ellis became a woman capable of such grace, one must go back 3 years, to a rooftop bar in Manhattan, where champagne flowed and dreams shattered. The venue was called Altitude, a name that promised elevation but delivered only pretension. String lights glittered against the skyline. Venture capitalists mingled with startup founders, each conversation a transaction dressed as camaraderie. Jason had chosen this place deliberately. He wanted witnesses. An audience gave weight to decisions, made them feel inevitable rather than cruel. Brianna arrived wearing a navy blazer she'd found at a consignment shop and tailored herself. She didn't know yet that this night would end everything. She only knew Jason had asked her to meet him here, surrounded by his colleagues, and that lately his affection had felt more like scrutiny. "Brianna." Jason's voice carried across the rooftop with performative warmth. He kissed her cheek, but his eyes were already scanning the crowd, measuring who was watching. "You remember everyone. Marcus, Devin, Emily." She smiled at the familiar faces, noting how their return smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Something felt wrong. The air held the metallic taste of ambush. It hadn't always been this way. 18 months earlier, they'd met at a startup accelerator's demo day in Brooklyn. Jason had just pitched his social analytics platform to lukewarm applause. Brianna had been in the audience, invited by a friend, scribbling notes in the margins of the program. During the networking session, she'd approached him with specific, thoughtful questions about his data architecture, the kind of questions that revealed she understood not just what he was building but why it mattered. "You actually get it," Jason had said, genuinely impressed. Most people glazed over when he talked about back-end infrastructure. "I'd love to get it better," Brianna replied. "Maybe over coffee?" That first coffee became dinner. Dinner became long walks through Prospect Park where they traded dreams like currency. Jason talked about disrupting industries, about building something that mattered. Brianna shared her vision for a platform that could democratize supply chain logistics for small businesses, particularly those owned by women and minorities who'd been shut out of traditional systems. "That's ambitious," Jason said, and at the time, it sounded like admiration. "Ambition is the only inheritance I got," Brianna replied with a smile that held both humor and truth. For months, they built something together. Not a business, but a partnership that felt equally valuable. Late nights reviewing each other's pitch decks. Early mornings strategizing funding approaches. Jason loved how Brianna's mind worked, the way she could identify the flaw in a business model within minutes, the way her questions sharpened his thinking. But somewhere between his first significant funding round and his second TechCrunch mention, Jason's appreciation curdled into something else. Resentment, perhaps. Or fear. It started subtly. When investors praised Brianna's insights during meetings, Jason would later claim he'd already thought of that. When her ideas improved his presentations, he'd introduce them as something we discussed, but accept the credit alone. The woman who'd once sharpened his vision became the woman who threatened to overshadow it. The breaking point came when Brianna secured her own pitch meeting with a mid-tier investor. She'd been working on her logistics platform nights and weekends, refining the model, building a prototype with freelance developers she paid in equity and faith. The investor loved it. They didn't fund her, too early stage, they said, but they introduced her to someone who might. Jason congratulated her over text. But when they met that evening, his smile was ice. "You're spreading yourself too thin," he said. "Trying to build your own thing while supporting mine. Something's going to suffer." "I can do both," Brianna replied. "I have been doing both. Maybe that's the problem." Jason set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. "You're distracted. And honestly, Bri, I'm not sure your concept is viable anyway. Logistics is a saturated market. What makes you think you can compete?" The criticism stung not because it was valid, but because it was designed to wound. Over the following weeks, Jason's support evaporated. He stopped reviewing her materials, started forgetting to introduce her at networking events, made jokes about her thrift store wardrobe in front of people whose opinions mattered. Each small cruelty was a test. How much would she tolerate? How small could he make her feel? Now, on this rooftop under string lights that suddenly felt like interrogation lamps, Jason raised his champagne glass and cleared his throat. The crowd quieted. "I want to say something," he began, his tone practiced. "Brianna and I have had an incredible run. She's brilliant, truly. But I've been doing some thinking about where I'm headed, the life I'm building, the circles I'm moving in, and I think we want different things." Brianna's stomach dropped. He was doing this here? Now. "The truth is," Jason continued, his voice taking on a note of regretful wisdom, "some people are meant for certain altitudes." He gestured vaguely at the skyline. "And some people are more comfortable closer to ground level. There's no shame in that. It's just reality." Emily Davenport actually gasped. Marcus looked away. The cruelty was so naked, so public, that even Jason's allies seemed uncomfortable. Brianna stood frozen, her face burning. Every eye on the rooftop was on her, watching for her reaction, waiting to see if she'd cry or shout or crumble. Jason's expression held something almost satisfied, as if her humiliation validated a decision he'd already made. But Brianna didn't give him the breakdown he expected. Instead, she set down her untouched champagne, looked Jason directly in the eye, and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "You're right," she said quietly. "We do want different things. You want altitude. I want substance." Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her navy blazer cutting through the crowd like a sail through shallow water. Behind her, she heard the murmurs begin, the uncomfortable shuffling, someone asking Jason if that was really necessary. She didn't look back. In the elevator down, alone, Brianna finally let the tears come. Not because Jason had broken her heart. She realized now that he'd broken it slowly over months. But because she'd let someone make her feel small when she'd spent her whole life fighting to be seen. By the time she reached the street, though, something had shifted. The tears stopped. Her jaw set. And in the space where Jason's approval had once lived, a harder, purer determination took root. He'd tried to silence her, dismiss her, erase her from the narrative of success he was writing for himself. But Brianna Ellis had never needed anyone's permission to matter. And she was about to prove it. The studio apartment in Washington Heights had water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanged like a ghost rattling chains. Brianna sat on the edge of a futon she'd bought off Craigslist, staring at her laptop screen in the blue dark of 3 a.m. outside. The city hummed with the kind of life that only existed when successful people were sleeping. She was not successful. Not yet. Rock bottom, Brianna discovered, wasn't a single catastrophic moment. It was a series of small humiliations strung together like cheap beads on a fraying thread. It was choosing between subway fare and coffee. It was wearing the same interview outfit 3 times in 1 week because it was the only one that looked professional. It was the particular shame of running into former colleagues at networking events and watching their eyes slide past her like she'd already become irrelevant. The breakup had cost her more than Jason. It had cost her access. Their shared circles closed ranks around him, not because they were loyal, but because he had momentum and she didn't. Investors who'd once entertained her emails now let them languish unread. The ecosystem that claimed to value meritocracy revealed itself to be exactly what she'd always suspected: a network of gatekeepers who protected their own. So Brianna stopped knocking on gates. She started building her own entrance. By day, she worked 3 different contract gigs. Executive assistant for a blockchain startup that would fold within 6 months. Email management for a venture capitalist who never learned her name. Social media consulting for a boutique PR firm that paid in exposure and occasional checks. The work was mind-numbing, but it paid rent. Barely. By night, she built. The concept she'd pitched to that mid-tier investor, the one Jason had called unviable, became her obsession. A localized AI-powered commerce platform designed specifically for minority-owned small businesses. The kind of businesses that traditional supply chain logistics ignored because they weren't scalable enough. Brianna knew better. She'd grown up watching her mother run a small catering business out of their kitchen, losing contracts to larger competitors not because her food wasn't good enough, but because she couldn't afford the inventory management systems that would let her compete on volume. What if technology could level that playing field? What if the same predictive algorithms that optimized Amazon's warehouses could be adapted, simplified, and deployed for the corner store, the family restaurant, the woman selling handmade jewelry at weekend markets? Brianna taught herself Python through YouTube videos. She hired freelance developers from Upwork, paying them in equity promises and installment payments that devastated her grocery budget. She tested prototypes with small business owners in her neighborhood, sitting in the back of bodegas and nail salons, asking questions and taking notes while her ramen went cold back home. Slowly, painfully, the platform took shape. The breakthrough came at a pitch event so small it didn't even have a name. Just Community Pitch Night, held in a WeWork conference room in Brooklyn. 15 founders, maybe 30 people in the audience. Most of them eating free pizza and checking their phones. Brianna was the 7th presenter. She had 8 minutes. She talked about her mother, about inefficiency as a tax on ambition, about how the businesses that fed neighborhoods and employed neighbors were being left behind by the very technology that should serve them. She showed her prototype, clunky, imperfect, but functional. She explained the revenue model, the growth projections, the market size that everyone else was ignoring. Most of the room looked bored, but one man in the back row leaned forward. Richard Callahan didn't look like a billionaire. He wore a simple gray sweater and wire-rimmed glasses. His shoes were expensive but understated. While other investors performed their disinterest like a negotiating tactic, Richard simply paid attention. When Brianna finished, he was the only person who approached her. Why hasn't anyone funded this yet? His voice was quiet, direct. Brianna had learned not to sugarcoat. Because I don't look like the founders they're used to betting on. Richard studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then let's change what a founder looks like. He handed her a business card, simple, cream-colored, just his name and email. Send me your deck. The real one, not the one you think I want to see. I'll review it this week. Brianna waited for the catch. There was always a catch. What's your typical check size? Depends on the opportunity, Richard said. But I'm less interested in what you need and more interested in what you're building. The capital follows the vision, not the other way around. She sent the deck that night expecting nothing. She'd learned to expect nothing. Richard's response came 36 hours later. A meeting invitation and a single line. Let's talk about partnership, not just funding. The meeting took place in Richard's surprisingly modest office in Midtown. No panoramic views, no ostentatious art. Just books, clean lines, and a whiteboard covered in mathematical equations Brianna couldn't parse. They talked for 3 hours. Richard asked questions that revealed he'd not only read her deck but understood the market better than most people who worked in it. You're solving the right problem, he said finally. But you're thinking too small. Brianna bristled. Small businesses are small. That's the point. I'm not trying to build the next unicorn. I'm not talking about business size. I'm talking about your ambition. Richard pulled up a market analysis on his screen. You're approaching this like you need permission to matter. You don't. This platform could redefine how an entire sector operates. But only if you build it like you believe that. He offered her seed funding on the spot. Not a small angel check but real money. Enough to hire a team, enough to scale, enough to build something that couldn't be ignored. But the offer came with a condition. I don't invest in revenge tours, Richard said, his gaze steady. I know who your ex is. I know what he did. And I'm sure there's a part of you that wants to prove him wrong. Brianna started to protest, but Richard raised a hand. Don't seek revenge, he continued. Just win. Build something so undeniable that his opinion becomes irrelevant. That's the only victory that lasts. Brianna sat with those words, feeling their weight. She thought about Jason's smirk on that rooftop. About the champagne glass raised in false tribute. About every investor who'd dismissed her, every room she'd been ignored in. Then she thought about her mother's catering business. About the bodega owner who'd tested her prototype and called it life-changing. About the future she could build if she stopped looking backward. Okay, she said finally. Let's win. Richard smiled and extended his hand. Then let's get started. And in that handshake, Brianna Ellis stopped being someone who survived Jason Whitmore's cruelty. She became someone building something he could never touch, never diminish, never claim. She became the founder she was always meant to be. 18 months could feel like a lifetime when spent building something real. Brianna hired her first employee in a coffee shop in Crown Heights. A brilliant back-end engineer named Marcus Chen who'd burned out at Google and wanted to build something that mattered. Her second hire was Keisha Williams, a UX designer who'd grown up in the same neighborhood Brianna had, who understood instinctively why accessible design wasn't just aesthetics but dignity. By month 3, Ellis Dynamics had a team of 7 people working out of a shared workspace in Brooklyn, fueled by Richard's capital and Brianna's relentless clarity of vision. She led differently than Jason had. Where he performed leadership, loud declarations in open offices, motivational posters about disruption, team drinks that were really just networking theater, Brianna simply worked. She asked questions more than she gave answers. She protected her team's time like it was sacred. When they succeeded, she credited them by name. When they failed, she took responsibility and asked what they'd learned. You don't manage like a typical founder, Marcus observed one evening as they debugged integration issues at 9 p.m. What do typical founders manage like? Brianna asked, not looking up from her screen. Like they're trying to prove something to everyone watching. Brianna smiled faintly. I'm not building this for watchers. I'm building it for users. The beta launch happened quietly in 3 pilot cities: Detroit, Oakland, and Atlanta. Markets where minority-owned small businesses formed the backbone of neighborhoods but operated on razor-thin margins. Brianna's platform promised them something revolutionary: AI-powered inventory prediction, supplier optimization, and logistics coordination. Tools that enterprise companies paid millions for, now accessible through a simple mobile interface for $49 a month. The first week, they signed 12 businesses. The second week, 31. By month 2, they had over 200 active users and a wait list growing faster than their infrastructure could scale. Revenue wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was real, recurring, and growing. Press coverage trickled in organically. A local Detroit newspaper profiled a bakery owner who'd increased her margins by 23% using Ellis Dynamics. TechCrunch picked up the story in a roundup of startups actually solving real problems. Then Forbes called, wanting to feature Brianna in their 30 Under 30 issue. "You should do it," Richard said when she hesitated. "Visibility helps." "Or it paints a target," Brianna replied. "You're not hiding anymore," Richard reminded her gently. "And you don't need to." The profile ran with a photo of Brianna in her Brooklyn office. No yacht or rooftop bar in sight, just her standing beside a whiteboard covered in user feedback. The headline read, "The founder democratizing supply chains one small business at a time." It was measured, substantive, focused on the work rather than the narrative. Exactly how Brianna wanted to be seen. She didn't post about it on social media. Didn't send it to old contacts. Didn't even tell her mother until 3 people from church had already brought it up. Success, Brianna had learned, didn't need to be performed. It just needed to be built, one deliberate decision at a time. While Brianna's empire grew quietly in Brooklyn, across town in a glass-walled office in Chelsea, Jason Whitmore's world was beginning to fracture. His social analytics platform had launched with significant fanfare 2 years earlier. A TechCrunch disrupt appearance, seed funding from a prominent VC firm, buzz that felt like momentum. But buzz wasn't revenue. And momentum without substance was just expensive motion. The problem was fundamental. Jason had built something that sounded innovative in pitch meetings but didn't solve a problem anyone urgently needed solved. Corporate clients tested the platform, nodded politely, and stuck with cheaper alternatives. User acquisition costs kept climbing. Churn rates hovered at 40%. The metrics told a story Jason refused to read. "We just need more runway," he told his board during an increasingly tense quarterly meeting. "Another 6 months and we'll hit our targets." But they'd been saying that for a year. The series of funding was nearly gone. Payroll was becoming a monthly crisis. 2 key engineers had already left for stable jobs at established companies. The investors who'd once praised Jason's vision were now asking pointed questions about burn rate and path to profitability. Jason needed a Series B round. Desperately. His team assembled a list of potential investors and began sending out decks with subject lines designed to grab attention. Revolutionizing social analytics, 10x growth opportunity, limited partnership availability. The pitches went out to everyone who mattered in the New York tech ecosystem, including one to Callahan Ventures. Jason barely remembered adding Richard Callahan to the list. His COO had suggested it during a strategy session. "Callahan's reclusive but occasionally takes meetings," she'd said. "Worst case, he ignores it. Best case, he's our lifeline." The deck went out on a Tuesday afternoon. Professional, polished, full of carefully massaged projections and strategic pivots that reframed struggling metrics as market calibration. Jason didn't research Richard's recent investments, didn't look at his portfolio companies. If he had, he would have seen Ellis Dynamics listed prominently, would have seen Brianna's name. But Jason had never been good at doing homework. He preferred operating on instinct and charm, on the assumption that his confidence could paper over gaps in preparation. The automated delivery receipt confirmed Richard had received the pitch deck. Jason felt a small surge of hope. Callahan was known for funding ambitious founders. Maybe this would be the turning point. In his Midtown office, Richard opened Jason's deck with mild curiosity. He read the executive summary, scanned the financials, reviewed the market analysis. Then he did what he always did. He researched the founder. Jason's LinkedIn was a masterclass in personal branding. Photos from conferences, quotes about disruption, endorsements from people whose names carried weight. But Richard had learned to read between the pixels. He cross-referenced Jason's claims, checked references discreetly, and found a pattern. Promising starts that fizzled, talented employees who left abruptly, metrics that looked impressive until examined closely. Then Richard found the connection he'd been waiting for. An old TechCrunch article mentioning Jason's recent breakup with fellow entrepreneur Brianna Ellis. A few more searches revealed the timeline. The rooftop bar incident, whispered about in founder circles. The public humiliation disguised as amicable separation. Richard sat back in his chair and allowed himself a rare smile. He forwarded Jason's deck to Brianna with a single line. Interesting timing. He has no idea who he's really pitching to. Brianna's response came minutes later. Are you going to tell him? Richard's reply was brief. Not yet. Let's see how this plays out. The irony was almost poetic. Jason Whitmore, desperate for capital, had unknowingly approached the one investor who had the most reason to reject him, and the most power to do it gracefully or devastatingly. The choice, Richard decided, would ultimately be Brianna's. But first, there was a yacht party to attend. The invitation arrived in Brianna's inbox on a Thursday morning, sandwiched between a vendor invoice and a meeting confirmation. Cream-colored digital stationery, embossed script, Jason's name in elegant typography at the top. She almost deleted it reflexively, but something made her pause. You're cordially invited to celebrate aboard the Sea Whisperer, Amalfi Coast. Join us for an evening of exceptional company and Mediterranean views. Dress code, yacht elegant. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of their history. Just her name on a list, one among what was probably hundreds. But Brianna knew better. Jason didn't do anything without calculation. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a stage, and she was being cast as the cautionary tale. Across town in his Chelsea office, Jason reviewed the guest list with the satisfaction of a general positioning troops. He'd rented the Sea Whisperer for a weekend, a 60-foot yacht that would serve as the backdrop for his carefully orchestrated display of success. The party was ostensibly to celebrate closing a partnership deal. Never mind that the deal was smaller than he'd pitched it to investors. What mattered was the optics. Did you send one to Brianna Ellis? Emily Davenport asked during a planning call, her tone carefully neutral. Jason's smile was sharp. Of course. Why not? Jason. It's been 3 years, Em. I'm over it. Besides, it'll be good for her to see how things turned out. He leaned back in his chair, spinning a Mont Blanc pen between his fingers. She's still floating around the city somewhere, doing whatever it is she does. Maybe she'll show. Maybe she won't. But Jason wanted her to show. He'd spent the past week casually mentioning the party to people who'd known them both, seeding the narrative he wanted told. At a networking mixer in Soho, he'd told a group of founders about the yacht, the guest list, the exclusivity of it all. When someone asked if Brianna would be there, Jason had shrugged with practiced nonchalance. I invited her. You know me, no hard feelings. Though I'm not sure she can make it. Last I heard, she was doing freelance work or something. He'd let the implication hang. Still struggling, still irrelevant, still exactly where he'd predicted she'd be. The whispers spread the way they always did in their incestuous tech ecosystem. By the time invitations went out, half of Manhattan's startup scene had heard some version of Jason's narrative. The successful founder extending magnanimous grace to his less fortunate ex. Some people found it generous. Others found it cruel. But everyone found it interesting. And interesting meant they'd come to watch. Richard Callahan heard about the party through 3 different channels before he saw the forwarded invitation from Brianna. He read it once, set it aside, and considered the angles. Then he picked up his phone. "Have you decided whether you're going?" he asked when Brianna answered. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Part of me wants to ignore it. Another part thinks." "Thinks what?" Brianna was quiet for a moment. "Thinks maybe it's time to stop hiding." Richard heard something in her voice. Not anger, not vindictiveness, but a kind of weary readiness. "Then don't go alone," he said. "Let me come with you." "Richard, you don't have to. I'm not offering out of obligation." His voice was gentle but firm. "Your platform is about to close a partnership with 3 major retailers. You're raising a Series A at a valuation that'll make headlines. You've built something real, Brianna. People should see that. People or Jason." "Everyone," Richard said simply. "Not to prove him wrong. To prove yourself right. There's a difference." Brianna stood in her office, looking out at the Brooklyn skyline. Ellis Dynamics hummed with quiet productivity around her. Keyboards clicking, voices collaborating, the sound of something being built. This was her world now. Jason's opinion of it, or of her, should be irrelevant. But she was also human. And there was something appealing about not having to shrink anymore. "It's not about revenge," Richard continued, reading her silence accurately. "It's about visibility. You've been heads down building for 18 months. That's good. That's necessary. But at some point you have to let people see what you've built. Otherwise you're still hiding, just from different people for different reasons." "Let them see me," Brianna repeated quietly. Exactly. She thought about the girl who'd walked out of that rooftop bar 3 years ago, tears streaming, world collapsing. She thought about the woman who'd eaten ramen at 3 a.m. while debugging code. She thought about the founder she'd become, not despite Jason's cruelty, but through the strength she'd found after it. "Okay," she said finally. "But we do this gracefully. I'm not interested in a scene." "Grace is the only revenge worth having," Richard replied. The decision, once made, settled into Brianna's bones with quiet certainty. She wasn't going to the Amalfi Coast to prove anything to Jason Whitmore. She was going to remind herself how far she'd traveled from the woman he'd tried to diminish. And if her presence happened to disrupt the narrative he'd been selling, well, that was just an accurate correction of the record. Over the next 2 weeks, Brianna prepared the way she prepared for everything. Deliberately and without fanfare. She confirmed her attendance with a simple RSVP. She made travel arrangements. She selected a dress, not to impress, but because she'd earned the right to wear things that made her feel powerful. A Balmain sheath in classic black and white check, elegant and unapologetic. Meanwhile, Jason's anticipation built like a fever. He checked the RSVP list obsessively, noted when Brianna's confirmation came through, and felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction. She was coming. She'd see everything he'd built, everyone who wanted proximity to him. The life he was living at the altitude she couldn't reach. What Jason didn't know, what his arrogance wouldn't allow him to imagine, was that Brianna would be arriving on a different kind of vessel entirely. Not the commercial ferry he assumed, not a water taxi hired to reach his anchored yacht, but aboard the Callahan Eclipse, Richard's private superyacht that made Jason's rented showpiece look like a child's toy. The irony was exquisite. The man desperate for Richard Callahan's investment would meet him for the first time at a party designed to humiliate the woman Richard had backed instead. 3 days before departure, Richard sent Brianna a text, "Pack light. And remember, you're not going back to his world. You're showing him he was never in yours." Brianna read the message twice, then set her phone down and returned to work. She had a product roadmap to finalize, a hiring pipeline to review, a company to build. The party was just a weekend. A moment. A brief interruption in the trajectory she'd chosen. But as the Amalfi Coast approached, she felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Not vindication. Just a quiet, unshakable certainty that she was no longer the woman Jason had broken on a rooftop 3 years ago. She was someone else entirely. And it was time to let him, and everyone else, see exactly who that was. The Mediterranean sun hammered down on the Sea Whisperer with the kind of golden intensity that made everything look like it belonged in a luxury magazine. Jason Whitmore stood at the center of his floating kingdom, champagne flute catching the light, surrounded by precisely the kind of people he believed validated his existence. Influencers posed against the yacht's white railings, angling phones to capture both their faces and the coastline. A tech journalist from a mid-tier publication circulated with a voice recorder, collecting quotable moments about innovation and disruption. Servers in crisp white shirts wove through clusters of guests, keeping glasses perpetually full. The playlist was curated, the conversation performative, and Jason's satisfaction complete. "This is incredible, Jason," Emily Davenport said, raising her glass. She wore oversized sunglasses and a linen dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "You've really outdone yourself." "Just wanted to bring everyone together," Jason replied with practiced modesty. "Celebrate the wins, you know? Life's good when you're building something that matters." He'd said some version of that line 17 times already. Each repetition felt more true, more deserved. Around him, people laughed at jokes that weren't funny, agreed with opinions they didn't hold, and performed the social choreography that Jason mistook for genuine connection. The party had been running for 40 minutes. Long enough for guests to settle in, for the champagne to loosen tongues, for Jason to hold court near the bow where the sightlines were best. He kept glancing toward the marina entrance, waiting. Part of him had convinced himself Brianna wouldn't show, that she'd received the invitation, understood its implicit message, and made the wise choice to stay away. But another part of him, the part that had orchestrated this entire performance, wanted her to come. Needed her to see this. To understand, finally and completely, the distance between his trajectory and hers. "Is that?" someone said near the stern. The comment was quiet, almost swallowed by music and conversation. But something in the tone made other heads turn. A ripple of attention moved through the guests like wind across water. Jason felt it before he heard it. A low, powerful hum that seemed to vibrate through the hull of his yacht. Engines. Big ones. He turned toward the open water, smile still fixed in place, and saw the silhouette emerging from the coastal haze. The yacht approaching was not just larger than the Sea Whisperer. It was a different species of vessel entirely. Sleek, impossibly white, with lines so clean they looked drawn by architects rather than boat builders. It moved through the water with the kind of effortless power that made Jason's rented yacht suddenly look like a decent effort at something it would never become. "Holy shit," someone whispered. "Is that the Callahan Eclipse?" The name detonated through the crowd like a depth charge. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones pivoted from selfies to documentation mode. Emily pulled her sunglasses down to stare openly. Richard Callahan's yacht? Marcus Chen, a venture capitalist Jason had been courting, stepped to the railing. What's he doing here? Jason's champagne flute froze halfway to his lips. Richard Callahan. The name alone carried weight in their world. the reclusive billionaire investor who could make or break startups with a single decision. Jason had sent him a pitch deck 2 weeks ago and received no response. He'd assumed it meant no. Now Callahan's 100-foot super yacht was pulling alongside the Sea Whisperer like a shark investigating a school of tropical fish. The Eclipse settled into position with barely a ripple. Its shadow fell across Jason's deck, literally and metaphorically. Crew members moved with military precision, securing lines, preparing the boarding platform. And then the main deck door opened. Brianna Ellis stepped into the sunlight. She wore a black and white checkered Balmain dress that somehow managed to be both classic and striking. Her hair pulled back in a way that showed off the elegant line of her neck and the diamond studs in her ears. But it wasn't the clothes or the jewelry that made every phone on Jason's yacht lift in unison. It was the way she carried herself, the posture of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and had no doubt about her right to be there. Behind her, Richard Callahan emerged in a simple linen blazer and white shirt, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of partnership, of mutual respect, of a connection that went deeper than business or circumstance. "Is that Brianna?" Emily's voice had gone up half an octave. The whispers multiplied, spreading like wildfire. Guests pulled out phones, some pretending to check messages while actually photographing the arrival. Others didn't bother pretending, openly documenting the moment. Jason could already see the narrative forming in real time, the posts that would be drafted, the group chats lighting up across the city. Jason tried to move forward to reclaim control of the moment, but his feet felt anchored to the deck. His brain struggled to process the contradiction between the image he'd been selling for 3 years and the reality stepping off a superyacht 50 feet away. Brianna turned toward the Sea Whisperer, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Jason. Her expression was calm, unreadable, not triumphant, not angry, just present. She raised a hand in a small wave, the gesture somehow more devastating than any dramatic entrance could have been. "Permission to come aboard?" Richard called out, his tone friendly but carrying the authority of someone who didn't actually need permission for anything. Jason's voice caught in his throat. He swallowed hard, forced his face into something resembling a smile and managed, "Of course. Welcome." The crew from the Eclipse lowered a boarding bridge, and Brianna crossed it with Richard beside her. She moved with the easy grace of someone who'd spent the last hour relaxing on a yacht that cost more than Jason's entire startup valuation, not scrambling to catch a commercial ferry like he'd imagined. As her feet touched the deck of the Sea Whisperer, Jason felt his carefully constructed moment collapse around him. Every guest had turned toward the new arrivals. The tech journalist was already repositioning, sensing a better story. The influencers had found a more interesting subject. "Hello, Jason," Brianna said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the guests closest to them. "Thank you for the invitation. I hope we're not late." Jason opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Brianna, this is unexpected. I didn't realize you knew." "Richard." Brianna glanced at the man beside her with what looked like genuine warmth. "We're partners, actually. Have been for about 18 months now." The word partners landed like a grenade. Jason saw Marcus Chen's eyebrows shoot up, saw Emily lean toward another guest to whisper frantically, saw his moment, his party, his carefully orchestrated display of dominance, slip through his fingers like champagne through a cracked glass. Richard extended his hand to Jason, his smile polite but his eyes assessing. "Jason Whitmore, I've heard a lot about you, and I believe I received your pitch deck recently." Jason shook the offered hand mechanically, his mind reeling. The pitch deck. The funding request that had gone unanswered. Suddenly, the silence made a different kind of sense. "Yes," Jason managed. "I wasn't sure if you'd had a chance to review it." "Oh, I reviewed it thoroughly," Richard said, his tone perfectly pleasant. Very thoroughly. We should talk about that later. But first, he gestured to the party around them, to the guests who were now openly staring. Let's not interrupt your celebration. But the celebration was already interrupted. The music still played, the champagne still flowed, but the center of gravity had shifted. It was no longer Jason's party. It belonged to the woman he'd invited to humiliate, who'd arrived on a bigger boat with the one man whose opinion could make or break Jason's entire future. And she hadn't said a single cruel word. She'd just shown up. Jason's survival instincts kicked in with the desperate efficiency of a drowning man grasping for driftwood. He'd built his entire career on the ability to control rooms, to redirect narratives, to make people believe his version of reality. This moment was no different. It couldn't be. "Brianna, you look amazing," he said, his voice pitched loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The smile he deployed was the one he used in pitch meetings when investors asked difficult questions. All teeth, no warmth, but convincing from a distance. "It's so good to see you. Really. I'm glad you could make it." He moved to kiss her cheek in the performative greeting their social circle favored, but Brianna simply extended her hand instead. The gesture was polite, professional, and devastatingly clear. They were not friends. The handshake lasted exactly as long as courtesy required and not a second longer. "Your yacht is lovely," Brianna said, her tone pleasant and utterly neutral. "The coast is beautiful this time of year." "Isn't it?" Jason seized the opening, gesturing broadly at the view as if he'd personally arranged the Mediterranean's existence. "I've been coming here for years. There's this restaurant in Positano, you'd love it. Very authentic. Not touristy. Maybe you and Richard could join us for dinner while you're here." It was a play for normalcy, for the appearance of magnanimity. "Look how gracious I am, inviting my ex and her, whatever Richard was, to dinner." But even as the words left his mouth, Jason heard how hollow they sounded. "We have a pretty full schedule," Richard said smoothly. "But thank you for the offer." Jason turned to Richard, trying to establish some foothold of connection. "So you two are working together? That's great. Really great. What's the project?" "Ellis Dynamics," Richard replied. "Brianna's company. We've been partners since the seed round." The name meant nothing to Jason. Should it? He scrambled mentally through recent tech news, acquisitions, funding announcements. Nothing surfaced. "Ellis Dynamics," Jason repeated, nodding as if he recognized it. "Interesting. What space are you in?" "Supply chain logistics," Brianna said. "AI-powered inventory and supplier optimization for small businesses, particularly minority-owned businesses that traditional platforms ignore." The description triggered something in Jason's memory, a fragment of a conversation from 3 years ago, a cafe in the East Village, Brianna talking excitedly about an idea while he scrolled through his phone. He'd called it cute. Unscalable. A waste of time. "Wait," Jason said slowly. "Is this the same concept you pitched to? Who was it, that investor in Brooklyn?" "Yes," Brianna confirmed. "The same one." Jason laughed. Too loudly, the sound nervous rather than amused. "Wow. I remember that. You were so passionate about it. I just didn't think." He caught himself, tried to recalibrate. "I mean, it's great that you found the right partner to make it work." "She didn't need to make it work," Richard interjected, his voice still pleasant but with an edge that cut like a scalpel. "The concept was already sound. She just needed someone who recognized that." The implication hung in the air between them. Jason felt Emily Davenport watching from 10 feet away, her phone suspiciously angled in their direction. Other guests had drifted closer, forming a loose semicircle, drawn by the scent of something more interesting than small talk and Prosecco. "So you're funding her?" Jason asked Richard, trying to sound casual, collegial, founder to founder. I'm partnering with her, Richard corrected. There's a difference. Brianna's the CEO. I'm just the guy who was smart enough to get in early. How early? Marcus Chen asked, stepping closer. The venture capitalist's interest was obvious, professional. Seed. Series A. We started at seed 18 months ago, Richard said. Just closed our series A last month. 8-figure valuation. Growing 40% month over month. The numbers detonated through the listening crowd like sequential explosions. 8 figures. 40% growth. These weren't startup fantasies or inflated projections. These were the metrics that made careers, that turned founders into covers of magazines. Jason felt the deck shifting beneath his feet, and it wasn't the waves. That's incredible, he managed. Congratulations, Brie. Really? But even he could hear the strain in his voice, the way Brie sounded presumptuous now, a familiarity he'd forfeited the right to claim. Thank you, Brianna said simply. You know, Richard continued, apparently unaware of or indifferent to the tension coiling through Jason's shoulders, it's actually fortuitous that we're here. I've been meaning to follow up on your pitch deck, Jason. Jason's attention snapped to Richard like a missile locking on target. Yes. I wasn't sure if it had reached you. Oh, it reached me. I read it very carefully. Richard accepted a champagne flute from a passing server, studied it with casual interest. Interesting projections. Though I have to admit, I'm a bit concerned about the fundamentals. The fundamentals are solid, Jason said quickly. We've been calibrating our market approach and... Your burn rate is concerning, Richard said, still in that same pleasant tone that somehow made every word more devastating. As is your churn. 40% is fairly high for a B2B platform, isn't it? Jason felt blood rush to his face. Those numbers were in the deck, buried in appendices, formatted to minimize their impact. Richard had clearly read every page. We're working on retention strategies. Of course you are, Richard said. Every struggling startup works on retention strategies. The question is whether those strategies address the core issue, which in your case seems to be product market fit, or rather, the lack of it. The guests around them had gone quiet. Emily wasn't even pretending not to listen anymore. Someone's phone was definitely recording. I think we found our market, Jason said, his voice tight. We're just in a transitional phase. I'm sure you are, Richard said. Unfortunately, I'm currently reviewing my portfolio, being more selective about where I deploy capital. I'm looking for companies that solve real problems for underserved markets. Companies that have substance behind the story. He glanced at Brianna, then back to Jason. I'm afraid your platform doesn't quite meet that threshold for me. The rejection was surgical, professional, and utterly final. Jason stood frozen, watching his last major funding hope evaporate in the Mediterranean sunshine while 30 people with phones and social media platforms documented every second. I understand, Jason said, though he couldn't. The world had inverted so completely he couldn't find his footing. But I do appreciate you sending it over, Richard continued. It's always valuable to see what's happening in the market. Helps me understand what not to invest in. The words landed like a slap disguised as a handshake. Around them, guests began to shift. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Marcus Chen stepped closer to Brianna, asking her about her growth metrics. The tech journalist angled toward Richard, sensing a better story than Jason's curated celebration. Even Emily drifted half a step away, her social calculus recalculating in real time. Jason stood at the center of his own party and felt it slip away from him like water through cupped hands. The woman he'd invited to Humiliate had arrived with the one man whose approval Jason desperately needed. And that man had just rejected him. Not privately, not gently, but publicly, in front of everyone who mattered. Brianna hadn't said a cruel word. Hadn't gloated or attacked or even acknowledged their history beyond basic civility. She'd simply existed in her success, and let that speak for itself. And somehow that was more devastating than any revenge Jason could have imagined. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, suspended between polite fiction and devastating truth. Then Emily Davenport's voice cut through the carefully maintained veneer like glass shattering. "Wait." She stepped forward, champagne sloshing slightly in her glass, her eyes moving between Brianna and Jason with the calculating precision of someone assembling a particularly delicious piece of gossip. "Wait, wait, wait. Supply chain logistics for small businesses? AI-powered inventory management." Her voice had gone up in volume and pitch, drawing even more attention than the conversation already commanded. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. "Isn't that the pitch you laughed out of the cafe 3 years ago, Jason?" Emily's tone wasn't malicious, exactly. Just loudly, publicly curious. The kind of curiosity that destroyed reputations. "I remember you telling everyone at that rooftop thing that her idea was cute but unscalable. That was this, wasn't it?" The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of waves against the hull seemed deafening. Jason's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, denial, anger, and finally a kind of trapped desperation. That was years ago. I don't really remember." "I remember," Brianna said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the silence it carried to every corner of the deck. "You said small businesses weren't a viable market. That I was thinking too small. That some ideas are passion projects, not businesses." "I was probably just trying to be realistic," Jason said, his voice tight. "You know how many startups fail. I didn't want you to waste your time." "On an 8-figure company?" Marcus Chen's eyebrows had climbed so high they'd nearly disappeared into his hairline. "Growing at 40% month over month? That's the kind of time-wasting most founders dream about." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones that had been lowered were raised again. Jason could practically hear the mental screenshots being taken, the group chats lighting up, the narrative being rewritten in real time. A man Jason had been courting aggressively for the past month, Daniel Rodriguez, a talented full-stack developer currently employed at a dying fintech, detached himself from the group near the bar and walked directly toward Brianna. "Excuse me," Daniel said, polite but determined. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you hiring? I've been following Ellis Dynamics since the TechCrunch piece. I've actually wanted to reach out for months." Brianna turned to him with what looked like genuine interest. "We're always looking for good people. What's your background?" And just like that, the developer Jason had taken to 3 expensive dinners, had pitched on equity packages and vision and potential, was having a recruiting conversation with his ex-girlfriend in the middle of his own party. "Daniel," Jason tried, his voice strained. "I thought we were going to continue our conversation about—" "I appreciate the conversations, Jason," Daniel said without turning around. "But I'm more interested in working on something with actual traction." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Jason felt his chest constrict, his carefully constructed world collapsing panel by panel like a house of cards in slow motion. Richard Callahan, who'd been watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of a scientist observing a predictable reaction, set down his champagne glass and turned to Jason with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and utterly final. "Jason, I want to be clear about your pitch deck," Richard said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone listen. "I'm passing on your Series B. And not because of timing or portfolio balance or any of the polite reasons investors usually give. Jason opened his mouth, but Richard continued. Your instincts seem unstable, Richard said, choosing each word with surgical precision. You had a brilliant founder pitching you a viable concept and you dismissed it because it didn't fit your preconceptions. That's not strategy. That's ego. And ego is expensive in this business. The crowd had formed a complete circle now, phone cameras barely concealed. This wasn't a party anymore. It was a spectacle, a public unwinding, a morality play staged on a yacht deck in the Mediterranean. That's not fair, Jason said, his voice cracking slightly. You don't know the full context. I know enough, Richard said. I know you let a generational talent walk away because she made you feel small. I know you've been telling people for 3 years that she'd never make it. And I know that while you were performing success, she was building it. Jason's mask, the confident smile, the casual superiority, the carefully cultivated persona of the successful founder, finally cracked. His face flushed deep red. His hands clenched at his sides. The desperation he'd been masking with bravado bled through every micro-expression. He looked around at the watching faces, seeing not admiration but pity, curiosity, judgment. This wasn't supposed to. Brianna stepped forward then, and the crowd quieted further, sensing something significant about to happen. She looked at Jason, really looked at him, with an expression that held no anger, no triumph, just a kind of peaceful clarity. Jason, she said gently, I want to thank you. He blinked, confusion briefly overriding humiliation. What? I want to thank you for teaching me what not to accept. Not in business. Not in love. Not in any relationship where I'm expected to make myself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. Her voice remained calm, kind even, which somehow made every word cut deeper. You believed my value was tied to your validation. And when I stopped shrinking to fit your expectations, you tried to destroy me. She paused, letting the words settle over the assembled crowd. But here's what you didn't understand. You never had the power to define my worth. You only had the power to reveal your own character. And you did. Publicly. Repeatedly. In front of everyone who mattered. Jason stood frozen, every defense stripped away, every comeback dying unspoken in his throat. So thank you, Brianna continued. Because if you hadn't been cruel, I might have stayed comfortable. If you hadn't dismissed my ideas, I might not have fought so hard to prove them viable. If you hadn't tried to humiliate me, I never would have learned that dignity isn't about never falling. It's about who you become when you get back up. She took a breath, her expression serene. I hope your party is everything you wanted it to be, she said. Then she turned to Richard. Shall we head back? Richard nodded, offering his arm. I think we've celebrated enough here. They moved toward the boarding bridge as the crowd parted like water before a ship's prow. Daniel Rodriguez fell into step behind them, still talking to Brianna about potential opportunities. Marcus Chen followed, mentioning something about portfolio introductions. Even Emily Davenport drifted in their direction, her social radar recalibrating toward Power's new center. Jason stood alone in the middle of the deck, surrounded by guests who were no longer looking at him but past him, toward the super yacht that had eclipsed his celebration. The music still played. The champagne still flowed. The sun still glittered on the Mediterranean. But the party was over. Not because everyone left. They didn't. They stayed, drinking his champagne, eating his catered food, standing on his rented yacht. But their attention, their respect, their desire for proximity to Power, all of it flowed toward the Callahan eclipse and the woman aboard it. Jason's party had become the stage for his fall. And the worst part, The part that would haunt him long after the yacht was returned and the photos were posted and the story spread through their industry like wildfire, was that Brianna had won without cruelty. She'd won with grace. And there was no defense against that. The Callahan Eclipse pulled away from the Sea Whisperer with the quiet authority of something that didn't need to announce its departure. No dramatic engine roar, no theatrical exit. Just a smooth, inevitable distancing that left Jason's yacht looking smaller in the rearview with every passing moment. Brianna stood on the upper deck, champagne flute in hand, watching the Amalfi Coast slide past in watercolor strokes of cream and terracotta and green. The tension she'd carried in her shoulders for the past hour, maybe for the past 3 years, began to dissolve into the salt air. Richard joined her at the railing, his own glass catching the afternoon light. For a long moment, they simply stood there, letting the Mediterranean wind carry away whatever residue the confrontation had left behind. "How do you feel?" Richard asked finally. Brianna considered the question carefully, testing her emotional state the way one might probe a healing wound. She waited for satisfaction, for vindication, for the rush of triumph she'd imagined might come with a moment like this. Instead, she felt only a deep, quiet peace. "Lighter," she said. "I didn't realize how much space he was still taking up in my head until I saw him and felt nothing. Not anger. Not vindication. Just distance." "You handled it with remarkable grace," Richard observed. Brianna smiled faintly. "I didn't come here to shame him," she said, more to herself than to Richard. "I came to remind myself I made it. That the woman he tried to make me believe I was small, limited, not enough, she never actually existed. She was just his fear reflected back at me." She took a sip of champagne, the bubbles bright and sharp on her tongue. Below them, crew members moved efficiently across the deck. Daniel Rodriguez was on his phone, already sending his resume to Ellis Dynamics hiring email. The world continued turning, indifferent to Jason Whitmore's wounded ego. "Do you regret coming?" Richard asked. "No," Brianna said immediately. "I needed to see him. Not to prove anything to him, but to prove something to myself. That I could stand in front of the person who tried to diminish me and not shrink. Not perform. Not pretend. Just exist as I am and let that be enough." Richard nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, you've never been anything less than enough. From the first moment you pitched me in that WeWork conference room, I saw exactly what he was too insecure to recognize." Brianna turned to look at him, this reclusive billionaire who'd taken a chance on her when no one else would. "Why did you back me, Richard? Really?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you were solving a real problem for people everyone else had written off. Because your pitch wasn't about ego or exits. It was about impact. And because I've learned that the best founders aren't the ones who've never been knocked down. They're the ones who get back up and build something beautiful from the pieces." Brianna felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away, laughing softly. "I'm not going to cry on a superyacht. That feels dramatically inappropriate." "You've earned the right to feel whatever you need to feel," Richard said. "Just remember, this isn't the end of your story. It's just the chapter where you learned you didn't need his approval to matter. You never did." On the Sea Whisperer, Jason Whitmore stood alone at the bow, watching the Callahan Eclipse grow smaller against the horizon. The party continued behind him. Guests still drinking, still talking, still taking photos. But the energy had fundamentally changed. What was meant to be a celebration of his success had become a wake for his credibility. He heard fragments of conversation drifting from the deck. Emily speculating about Brianna's valuation. Marcus discussing potential investment opportunities with someone on speakerphone. The tech journalist interviewing a guest about the most dramatic reversal she'd witnessed at a networking event. Jason had orchestrated this entire weekend to prove he'd won. To demonstrate his altitude, his superiority, his vindication in leaving Brianna behind. Instead, he'd proven only how small his vision had been, how fragile his ego was, how little he'd actually built when stripped of performance and pretense. The yacht beneath his feet was rented. The guests were transactional. The success he'd been celebrating was smoke and mirrors and venture capital he could no longer raise. Meanwhile, Brianna had built something real. Something that mattered. Something that would outlast champagne toasts and Instagram posts and gilded invitations designed to wound. He looked small now. Not because of the size of the boat, but because of the choices he'd made. The cruelty he'd weaponized. The talent he'd dismissed because it threatened him. Jason pulled out his phone, stared at the screen for a long moment, then opened his messages. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, pride and desperation wrestling for control. Finally, he typed, "Brianna, I owe you an apology. A real one. You were always the visionary. I was just too insecure to see it. I'm sorry for what I said on that rooftop. I'm sorry for trying to make you smaller so I could feel bigger. You deserved better. You were always better." He read it 3 times before hitting send, then watched the message show as delivered. Read. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, Brianna's response came through. 2 words. "I know." Jason stared at those 2 words for a long time. Not cruel. Not dismissive. Just honest. A statement of fact from someone who'd moved so far beyond his opinion that it no longer held weight. He pocketed his phone and turned back toward his party, toward the guests who were already calculating their exits, toward the future he'd have to rebuild without the shortcuts he'd relied on. Behind him, the Callahan eclipse disappeared into the coastal haze. That evening, back in her stateroom aboard the Eclipse, Brianna sat by the window and watched the sun paint the Mediterranean in shades of amber and rose. Her phone rested on the table beside her, Jason's apology still glowing on the screen. But I know felt complete, true, final, because she did know, had always known, underneath the doubt and pain and humiliation. Had known her ideas were sound, her vision was clear, her worth was inherent rather than assigned. Jason's approval had never been necessary. His cruelty had never been deserved. His return to her inbox, 3 years too late, was just confirmation of what she'd already learned. Grace triumphs. Always. Revenge isn't needed when you've built something real. When you've become someone who no longer requires external validation. When you've learned that the best response to someone who tried to diminish you isn't destruction. It's indifference paired with excellence. Brianna's presence at that party, on that yacht, in that moment, had been her power. Not what she said. Not what she did. Just who she'd become. And that, she realized as the Mediterranean sunset faded into twilight, was the only victory that ever really mattered. She picked up her phone, opened her email, and returned to work. Ellis Dynamics had a product launch in 2 weeks. A hiring pipeline to fill. A future to build. Jason Whitmore had already taken up enough of her time. The rest of her story would be written without him. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.